Elara had never belonged, not truly. From a young age, she could sense the quiet distance in her parents' eyes, as though they were forever watching her through frosted glass. Born into a small, deeply religious farming community in the Appalachian foothills, she learned early that daughters were expected to grow into wives, and wives into mothers. Her mother, Ruth, was a stern woman with calloused hands and a spine of iron. Her father, Marcus, was quieter, but no less formidable, and spoke most often through the worn leather of his Bible or the thick, coiled belt that hung beside the door. There was a time, long ago, when her mother braided her hair in the kitchen after breakfast, and her father tossed her into the air to make her laugh. But that time ended abruptly the winter she turned 11. She'd fallen ill with a strange fever that burned through her body for days. She recovered, eventually, but something shifted afterward. She stopped bleeding by the time she was 15. The community healer, an old midwife named Mrs. Crowley, took Elara aside after a third missed cycle and gently explained that her body was likely barren. The illness, or perhaps the medicine that had saved her, had also taken something precious. She remembered the way the wind howled outside that day, the way her hands trembled in her lap. "You can live a good life, child," Mrs. Crowley had said kindly, her weathered hand resting on Elara's. "There are other ways to love, other kinds of family." But Elara knew better. Not here, not in this place, not in a community where a woman's worth was measured by the children she bore. When her parents found out, they didn't speak to her for days, then weeks. Her mother stopped sitting beside her in church. Her father didn't look at her during grace. Her younger siblings, taught to mimic their elders, turned away too. She became a shadow in her own home, useful only for chores, tolerated only for appearances. Her brothers grew up strong and favored, their futures mapped out in land and inheritance. Her younger sister, and bloomed into the kind of beauty their mother approved of, docile, fertile, devout. Meanwhile, Elara remained, invisible and unwanted. She was 17 when she overheard her mother speaking in hushed tones to the pastor's wife. "It's unnatural," Ruth had said. "God's testing us. Who's going to want a girl like that? She's no better than a cracked vessel." From that day on, Elara did not look at herself in the mirror. Years passed like this. She watched other girls her age marry boys they had grown up with disappear into homes of their own, swell with pregnancy like the crops in spring. Elara, meanwhile, remained under her parents' roof like a weed no one could pull out but everyone resented. She spent her days tending the garden, helping with the livestock, mending her siblings' clothes, and staring out the window at a world that would never belong to her. Then came the visit from the man. He arrived on a pale afternoon in September, when the air smelled of dried corn husks and the earth was beginning to die. He was not from the community. He wore a heavy coat of brown wool and had a beard that looked like it belonged to someone twice his age. Elara saw him from the kitchen window, standing awkwardly with Marcus at the gate, his eyes glancing occasionally toward the house. She sensed immediately that he wasn't a traveler passing through. He was here for something or someone. They talked for a long time, low and urgent. When the man left, Marcus didn't say a word. But Ruth made her favorite stew that night, lamb and barley, and sat across from her for the first time in years. Elara should have known something was wrong then. Her family had not shown her affection in so long that the sudden kindness made her suspicious. But a part of her, a small fragile part, still craved their love. So she let herself believe, for one night, that maybe they had changed. 3 days later, she was told to pack her things. "Your prayers have been answered," Ruth said, not quite meeting her eyes. "A man from out west has offered to marry you. He knows your situation, but he's older, widowed, no children. He has a farm, and he's lonely. It's a good life." Elara had no say. The arrangements had been made. She was to leave the next morning. Marcus pressed a rough hand against her back and said, "Be grateful someone's willing to take you." They gave her a second-hand suitcase, a worn wool coat, and $50, perhaps the only money her parents ever gave her willingly. She sat in the back of the man's truck, watching the house grow smaller until it disappeared behind the rolling hills. At first, the man was polite. His name was Henry. He smoked pipe tobacco and listened to talk radio. He answered her questions with tight nods or vague mutterings. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, like he already regretted the arrangement. After 3 long days of travel, they reached a border town nestled deep in the snowy woods of Montana. There, everything unraveled. He booked them into a dingy motel that smelled of mildew. That night, he came into her room uninvited, stinking of whiskey and sweat. He wasn't cruel, but he was rough, expectant. When she flinched and refused, when she told him she wasn't ready, he pulled back with a grunt of disgust. "You really are broken," he muttered. "Guess I should have checked before I paid." The next morning, he was gone, along with her money, her suitcase, and her coat. Elara wandered into the icy morning in a panic, her breath hitching in her throat. Snow was beginning to fall. She walked out of town, down a service road that led into the woods, her limbs stiff from cold. She had no idea where she was or where she could go. Each step felt heavier than the last. Her thoughts were a blur of fear and shame. Her body, this body she had always hated, was failing her again. Eventually, her legs gave out beneath her. She sat down on the frozen earth, curled into herself, and began to weep, not out of fear, but out of something older, deeper. The pain of being discarded again, the confirmation that she was indeed as worthless as everyone had said. That was when she heard the footsteps. They were heavy, deliberate. A silhouette moved through the trees, tall, broad-shouldered, dragging a sled stacked with chopped wood. He was wrapped in a thick, flannel-lined coat, his beard white with frost. He saw her lying there and stopped, frowning. "Miss?" he asked. His voice was low, uncertain. "You all right?" She couldn't answer. Her lips were blue, her fingers stiff. She tried to speak, but only a small sound escaped. The man set down the sled and moved quickly to her side, pulling a blanket from his bag and wrapping it around her. "You're freezing," he muttered. "We got to get you inside." He carried her, actually carried her, back down the trail, cradled in his arms like a broken bird. Elara faded in and out of consciousness, but she remembered his voice, steady and calm, as he told her, "You'll be okay. You're safe now." The cabin was small, but warm. A fire roared in the stone hearth, and the scent of pine and old wood hung in the air. Children's voices came from the upstairs loft. 4 of them, she would later learn. All young, all quiet, watching her with wide eyes. The man's name was Gareth. He was a lumberjack by trade, a widower by fate. His wife, a nurse, had died of pneumonia 2 winters ago. Since then, he had raised the children alone, 2 girls and 2 boys. The oldest was 9, the youngest only 3. He didn't speak much of his past, but she could tell he carried a heaviness in him, a grief not yet released. He gave her hot soup, dry clothes, and his own bed for the first night. He slept on the floor beside the fire, a rifle tucked beneath his arm more out of habit than fear. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. He simply let her rest. Days passed, then weeks. She began to speak again, little by little. He listened, nodding but never interrupting. When she told him the truth, that her parents had sold her, that the man had abandoned her when he found out she couldn't bear children, Gareth looked away, jaw clenched. "People like that don't deserve daughters," he said quietly. "Or wives." Elara didn't know what to say. No one had ever said something like that in her defense. No one had ever sounded angry for her. The children began to grow used to her. They called her Miss Elara, at first, shy and curious. She read to them at night, helped with meals, mended their clothes, sang lullabies she barely remembered learning. Slowly, the cabin felt less like a place she was borrowing and more like a place where she might belong. Still, she didn't allow herself to hope. Hope, she had learned, was dangerous. Nothing lasted. Not love, not kindness, not homes. She had learned that the hard way. So when Gareth said, one morning over coffee, "You can stay as long as you like," she didn't answer. Because she didn't believe him. Not yet. The journey from the dusty, heart-wrenching transaction in the frontier town to the secluded homestead nestled deep in the northern woods marked not just a change in scenery, but a profound shift in the girl's destiny. Her name was Elsie. She had been sold like livestock, handed over in silence for a bag of coins, and now rode quietly in the cart behind a man she didn't know, her hair tangled, her heart heavier than she'd ever known. Though the air grew cooler and crisper as they moved north, her chest burned with the betrayal she couldn't shake. Her parents' last words weren't farewells, just grumbles over the meager price she had fetched. The man's name was Boone. A lumberjack by trade, Boone was as solid and weathered as the mountains that watched over his land. He didn't speak much, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Words were something he used sparingly, like matches in a snowstorm. A widower for over 5 years, Boone had been raising 4 children alone, 2 girls and 2 boys, after his wife succumbed to pneumonia one cruel winter. The children were spirited and loud, each bearing the defiance of youth shaped by loss. Boone had not wanted a replacement wife. He hadn't wanted anything, really, except to keep them all alive one season after the next. When they reached the cabin, the children greeted them with suspicion. Ivy, the eldest at 13, folded her arms and narrowed her eyes. "Who's she?" she demanded. "What's she doing here?" Boone didn't answer right away, and Elsie didn't dare to speak. Instead, he gestured toward the cabin and simply said, "She'll be staying." The cabin was rough-hewn but sturdy, tucked against a stretch of pine that seemed endless. The children's stares stung more than words. They weren't cruel, just wary. They'd seen people come and go, especially temporary help Boone hired from nearby settlements. No one ever stayed long. Why should this girl be any different? Elsie's first weeks were a blur of silence and strain. She rose before the sun to milk goats, wash laundry in freezing creek water, and carry firewood up the hill, often slipping on the frosted ground. Her hands cracked and bled. Her back ached. Yet Boone never yelled, never struck her, and never looked at her with disgust like her parents had. He simply expected her to try, and he noticed when she did. Still, Elsie lived with the echo of her past. The cruelty of being deemed useless because a midwife once whispered she might never bear children. That idea had rooted in her spirit like rot. Her parents had sold her with no more discussion than they might sell a worn saddle. Boone wasn't like that, but still, she waited for the day he'd send her away too. One evening, about a month after she arrived, Elsie dropped a pan of stew and flinched instinctively, expecting a blow. Boone turned, startled. "You hurt?" he asked, kneeling to help her pick up the mess. His voice held no rage, only concern. She shook her head. "I'm sorry. I'll clean it." Boone paused, then said something that made her chest tighten. "You don't gotta flinch. Nobody hits here. We don't do that." That night, she cried into the quilt she'd been given, the first time she'd allowed herself to cry since leaving home. Gradually, things began to shift. Ivy still glared at her often, but when Elsie noticed her struggling to lift a sack of grain one afternoon, she silently took the other end. The 2 girls hoisted it together without a word. Later that night, Ivy slid half a biscuit across the table to her. It wasn't kindness, it was truce. Boone's youngest, Tommy, a bright-eyed boy of 6, followed Elsie like a shadow. He asked her to tie his boots, to read from the Bible, to sing lullabies she barely remembered. One evening, he handed her a pine cone decorated with twigs and berries. "It's you," he said. "I made you a forest doll." Elsie smiled for the first time in months. Spring crept in slowly. Snow melted into mud, and the woods came alive with bird song and the rustle of deer in the distance. Boone took Elsie into the forest with him sometimes, teaching her how to fell smaller trees, how to identify pine from spruce, and how to avoid black bear dens. She had never known work could be sacred, but with Boone it felt that way, slow, steady, and grounding. Still, not all was easy. One night, Ivy lashed out in frustration when Elsie accidentally ripped a stitch on her only winter dress while trying to repair it. "You're not our family," she yelled. "You think just 'cause Pa brought you here, you belong? You don't." The words sliced through Elsie's thin armor. She ran outside, barefoot in the snow, heart racing. Boone found her sitting by the woodpile, shivering. She's right, Elsie whispered. I'm not your family. I'm just some girl they didn't want. Boone sat beside her, knees cracking as he lowered himself to the stump. That's not what I see. She looked at him, eyes puffy. Why did you take me then? He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, when my wife died, everything went quiet. I could chop it all day and still hear that silence. My kids were drowning in it too. I thought maybe if there was someone here, not to fix things, just to share him, it might help. Elsie listened, stunned. I didn't buy you, Boone added. I paid your father to get him to leave you somewhere safer. He didn't want you. That doesn't mean no one does. That moment changed something. For the first time in years, Elsie felt something like hope kindle in her chest. Not quite love, not yet, but the beginning of it, the roots. The seasons rolled on. Elsie turned 16 in the summer, marked only by Boone quietly placing a carved wooden hairpin beside her bowl at breakfast. She wore it every day afterward. She helped the kids with chores, taught the younger ones to sew patches, and slowly earned their trust. Ivy even asked her once how to braid her hair. But healing, like growth, is uneven. Some nights, Elsie still woke sweating, her parents' words echoing in her dreams. You're broken. You'll never have a family. Sometimes she still believed them. Then came the Harvest Festival. The lumber camp held one each fall, and Boone rarely went, but this time, Ivy begged to attend. Boone surprised everyone by agreeing. We'll all go, he said. Even Elsie. She wore a second-hand dress Ivy helped repair and braided her hair with pine sprigs. The townspeople gawked at first. Boone, showing up with some strange girl and his brood of half-wild children. But Elsie held her chin high. When a fiddler called for dancing, Tommy dragged her by the hand. Boone watched from the edge of the crowd, a rare softness in his gaze. That night, as they returned home under a sky ablaze with stars, Ivy nudged Elsie. You look nice, she muttered. Elsie turned, surprised. Thanks. There was silence between them. Then Ivy added, I don't hate you. I just didn't want to lose what little we had. I'm not here to take anything, Elsie said. Ivy nodded. I know. Now. The next morning, Boone handed Elsie a small satchel and told her to meet him in the workshop behind the cabin. Inside, she found a wooden sign carved with her name. It was rough but beautiful. We're building you your own room, he said. You're not a guest, not a servant, not a mistake. Elsie traced the lettering with trembling fingers. Your home. Tears welled in her eyes. By the time winter returned, the family felt whole in a way none of them had expected. Boone still spoke little, but his presence was steady. Ivy, once sharp-tongued, now shared jokes and stories by the hearth. The boys idolized Elsie. And Elsie? She no longer feared being cast aside. She'd started writing, too, journals, mostly about life in the woods, the strange journey she'd been on, and the family she'd found by accident. A family not defined by blood, but by choice. And for the first time in her life, Elsie believed that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't broken at all. She was becoming. She was wanted. She was loved. The arrival of spring brought a new rhythm to the cabin deep in the forest, where snow once blanketed the earth and silence fell like a curtain each evening. Now there was birdsong at dawn and the whisper of leaves unfolding under a warmer sun. Elsie, now nearly 17, stood barefoot in the early morning dew, her dress swaying gently as she hung damp linens over a clothesline tied between two birch trees. The mountains in the distance shimmered with mist, and below them, the forest breathed. It had been nearly 3 years since she'd been sold, bought like livestock, and carted off into the unknown. But now, as her hands worked with ease and familiarity, stringing each sheet with a confident clip of the clothespin, it was hard to imagine she had ever belonged to anyone but the cabin and the people in it. Lars, the lumberjack who had taken her in, had proven to be far more than the quiet, brooding man people in the nearest town whispered about. He was kind, if awkward, with a sense of deep justice and patience that only men who'd suffered truly understood. He'd never asked her to call him father, nor had he pushed her to pretend she was his daughter. But over time, that's what she became, his daughter in spirit, if not by blood. The 4 children who had once eyed her with a mix of hope and skepticism now ran to her when they scraped knees, needed help with lessons, or had nightmares. Elsie, who once barely spoke for fear of saying something wrong, now read to them every night, taught the girls to bake, and comforted them with lullabies that echoed with longing for a childhood she never had. The cabin, once merely shelter, was now a home. She had planted wildflowers around the porch, taught the children how to build scarecrows for their vegetable garden, and painted the window shutters a soft blue. The inside smelled of cinnamon and pine, and the bookshelves, built by Lars's calloused hands, were filled with dog-eared pages she had read a dozen times. But peace rarely lasted long for souls who had known the cruel branding of abandonment. It started with a letter. Lars came back from the town post office with a single envelope, yellowed at the edges, addressed in delicate script that looked familiar in a way that made Elsie's stomach twist. He didn't open it. Instead, he placed it gently on the table and slid it toward her after supper, his eyes steady, voice low. "This came for you," he said. "I didn't read it. Thought it best you decide if you want to." She stared at the paper for hours before opening it. When she finally did, the words seemed to crawl off the page like insects, biting old wounds open again. "Elsie, if this reaches you, I hope you'll find it in your heart to forgive us. We've made mistakes, unforgivable ones, I know. Your father is sick. The doctors say he won't last a year. I've prayed every night for your soul, child, for what we did, for how we failed you. Please, come home, Mother." Elsie's hands trembled as she folded the letter and tucked it beneath the wooden bread box. She didn't cry. Not then. Not that night. But sleep never came. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of the children's breathing in the room next door. In the morning, Lars didn't ask. He just handed her a canteen, packed a small satchel with bread, dried apples, and smoked venison, and placed his only horse's reins in her hands. "You don't owe them anything," he said quietly. "But if you feel you need to see it through, I'll hold your place here, however long it takes." And so she rode, through forests thick with memory, past streams where she once wept, and into the valley where her old life still breathed in the cracked windows of the cottage she had once called home. Her mother met her at the door, thinner than she remembered, her eyes rimmed red but sincere. She didn't embrace her, just stepped aside, allowing Elsie in like a ghost returning to haunt its former life. Her father lay in the same room he once forbade her from entering when he was drinking. Now the bottles were gone. He looked smaller, no longer a towering tyrant, but a hollow shell of a man eaten away by guilt and illness. "I deserve to die before seeing you again," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "But God, He gave me this one chance. One last time to say I was wrong. So wrong." Elsie sat beside him, unsure if she felt anger or pity or something else entirely. There were no dramatic speeches, no slaps or shouted accusations, just silence. And then, a trembling hand reaching for hers. She stayed a week, helped nurse him in his final days, watched as her mother clung to prayer like it could reverse time. But no miracle came. When the end arrived, it was quiet like a candle flickering out. At the funeral, no one from town offered comfort. Most still whispered about what had happened. How could they not? Selling a child was a sin people didn't forget, even if they smiled politely at your doorstep. But for Elsie, the trip wasn't about redemption for them. It was about reclaiming herself, closing the book on a chapter she never wrote but was forced to live in. Before she left, her mother tried to hand her a bundle of money. Elsie refused. Instead, she took one thing from the house, a small wooden box she had carved as a child, filled with trinkets, a broken hair ribbon, a smooth river stone, and a tiny drawing of a cabin surrounded by trees. When she returned to Lars's homestead, the children met her at the gate, rushing with laughter and sticky fingers holding handfuls of berries. She dropped her satchel and fell to her knees, letting them knock into her like waves. Lars stood on the porch, the wooden sign with her name still above the door. He didn't speak, just nodded once, his eyes saying everything words couldn't. Years passed. The forest grew thicker, the cabin stronger. Lars's hair turned gray, and the children grew taller. One by one, they carved lives of their own, some settling nearby, others chasing adventure beyond the valley. Elsie never left again. She inherited the cabin when Lars passed away, quietly one spring, sitting in the chair he built by hand, a book half-read in his lap. She buried him beneath the birch tree they had planted together. The cabin became hers in more ways than one. She began to take in others, orphans, runaways, widows with nowhere to go. She taught them how to plant gardens, how to find edible herbs, how to cook with little. She taught them how to heal, not just wounds on the body, but the kind buried deep in the soul. Her story, once defined by what had been done to her, was now about what she had built. Not from money or power, but from courage, patience, and the unwavering belief that love, real love, had no conditions. People in town stopped whispering. They began sending children to her when tragedy struck. They called her Miss Elsie of the Woodlands. Some said she was a healer, others a saint. But to those who knew, she was simply a survivor who turned her pain into something beautiful. And in the end, that's what remained. Not the shame, not the betrayal, but the laughter of children echoing through the trees. The smell of bread rising in the oven. The warmth of a home built not from blood, but from choice. Elsie's past had sold her, but her future, her true family, had bought her back with love, one day at a time.